It goes without saying that 2020 was a very strange year, but in that strangeness, we got albums from Dua Lipa, Taylor Swift, The Weeknd, Miley Cyrus. The list is endless. They are all records that have either turned 5 or are turning 5 this year, and I want to know whether they aged well or whether they aged poorly outside of the context of that very strange year. This is the Pop Pod, and I am Sam, also known as Pop Sam Cam. Thank you so much for joining me. Once again, if you're new here, why don't you go and follow or subscribe to the podcast? If you're a pop fan, I think you're going to like everything that we have in store weekly for you. We review all the new music, plus we look back on albums that were really important. We talk about topics that are coming up, whether that be Chapel Roan, whether that be Sabrina Carpenter. There is so much coming up, so follow the podcast. If you're a pop fan, you can also follow us on Discord, where you can jump in and chat with other pop fans about all the new releases and also old releases that you feel are underappreciated. Also, if you rate the podcast 5 stars, it does help a lot with people discovering this, as we are a relatively new podcast. But the Pop Pod community is growing bigger and bigger, and it is very fun to have you all on board. I want to talk about the year 2020. I know it's a year that many of us would not like to talk about, but it was 5 years ago now, which is crazy to think about. And despite it being a very strange year for music, it was actually a very important year for music. We got some huge releases, and many of them came in quite a non-traditional fashion because of what COVID had thrown us into. A lot of these albums went without being toured. A lot of them were dropped without any warning, and a lot of them had promotional campaigns that were just not what we were used to at all. So I actually thought it would be a very interesting exercise to go back on some of the major pop releases from this year and just see how they've aged in the year of 2025, when things are once again very different. Many of the artists on this list have dropped 1, 2, even 3 albums since these albums came out. So I'm interested to also talk about how they stack up to those records too. Let's get started. I feel like the best one to start with is Dua Lipa's Future Nostalgia. This one I remember so vividly, and I've actually gone back on this on an episode and talked about Future Nostalgia too, but I remember it so vividly being the start of the pandemic. Obviously, Dua Lipa was forced to release this because it leaked, and I feel like had that not have happened, she may have considered pushing this album back, as many artists did during that period. But instead, she went full throttle into it and kind of became the voice of lockdown in some sort of way. She continued to promote the record. She did lots of strange, kind of unconventional performances on late night shows and really helped this album become a massive part of her career. If not the kind of driving force of her career, it propelled her into superstardom, I think, and gave her some of her biggest songs, Levitating, obviously, being the biggest, but also Don't Start Now, Physical, Break My Heart, so many major moments from this record. And from my return to it earlier this year, basically what I found is that it stacks up. I think it's still very fun. I think it's still a very strong pop record. And I think that in the 5 years since it's released, it's only become more a part of conversations about pop classics or pop Bibles, because it just does have such a strong roster of singles. And this album was burning well into 2022 because she was touring it for so long. So I feel like with this one, you have to say that it has aged well. It's aged exceptionally well, and I think it will continue to age well. Let's talk about The Weeknd's After Hours. This was the start of a trilogy that has since included Dawn FM and also Hurry Up Tomorrow, which concluded it this year and kind of brought the Weeknd chapter seemingly to a close, I think. This was another one that came very early on in lockdown. I think potentially came before lockdown. Blinding Lights was obviously starting to get some momentum, but I don't think anybody quite saw how much this song was going to become a part of the pop psyche of all time. Like, this song is absolutely massive. I think it's the most streamed song of all time and has not really dimmed at all. I feel like this is the kind of song that you can play at weddings and every single generation knows it. It is like a once in a lifetime pop song that I think The Weeknd could, if he continues the Weeknd moniker, could spend the rest of his career chasing, basically. And because of that, it's easy for the whole After Hours album to be outshone in some kind of way. But I remember this album coming out. I remember it feeling like a very dark time. And this album seeming exciting because it's really a world-building album. It takes you into something different. A lot of the songs are stitched together. The visual element of it was very important as well. So it really did feel like an escape into the Weeknd's universe. And 5 years later, I think that's still true because the hits on this still stand up. I think that some of the deep cuts still really stand up. Hard to Love being one that I absolutely still love. And also, he had another massive hit on it with Save Your Tears, which the lifeline of it was extended through the inclusion of Ariana Grande on it as well, and that incredible iHeartRadio performance that they gave. So this one has just continued to burn, and I think more so than the other two that have had kind of a shorter shelf life. This one has really stood the test of time, and I think it's impossible to say that it hasn't aged well. Let's talk about Lady Gaga's Chromatica, another one that was meant to come out early on in the pandemic. She ended up delaying it a little bit, but then she did release it. She kind of had, I think she at least had 2 major videos filmed for this with Stupid Love and Rain on Me. Rain on Me went on to be a number 1 single for the record, the only number 1 song from the album. And this one's a really hard one to measure because at the time, this one felt very important because it was a dance pop record, and as it turned out, what people wanted during that period was danceable music and music that you could kind of feel like you were escaping into a club or into a space that you really couldn't be in physically. And Chromatica was such a soundtrack to that, and because of that, I have such an emotional attachment to it in some kind of way. But the release of Mayhem has helped me step back from that and assess Chromatica as what it is. And I really thought it was a good record, and I still think it's a pretty good record. But what the difference between Chromatica and Mayhem is that Mayhem, she puts her full body and all her guts into it. You can hear the grunt in her voice. You can hear that Lady Gaga passion that is just unmistakable. And I think that Chromatica doesn't quite have that when you go back to listen to it. It's by far her most smoothed over album, bar perhaps the Tony Bennett ones. But even then, she's got like a kind of vocal ferocity to her. Chromatica feels just smoothed over where it didn't need to be. And I think I've seen a lot of the interviews pop up recently, particularly the Zane Lowe one, where it just looks like she is really going through it. And she does not really want to be making a record at that time, particularly a record where the lyrics are quite emotional. But the musical backbed just doesn't really quite elevate that emotion for me. Potentially on a song called like Replay, I think that she gets there when she really goes for it vocally at the end. I think that 911 gets into that kind of like hysteria and obviously that sort of, I guess, almost psychotic nature of the record, but everything else going back on it just falls a little bit short for me in terms of giving us the full emotion. And given that she hasn't performed this at any of her Mayhem shows, I'm getting the sense that she doesn't feel overly fond towards this record, or at least the time period around this album. So I'm actually going to say that this one hasn't aged well since 2025. And when I say it didn't age well, I don't mean that it's a bad record. I just mean that the way that we regarded it in 2020 is not the way we're regarding it in 2025. Let's move on to a really interesting one, which is Taylor Swift's Folklore. Taylor Swift's Folklore. We'll go on to talk about Evermore next, but Folklore was a really interesting one because here's a pop star who we knew for very well rolled out, very manicured album releases. She was very much the like 1 or 2 singles before and then the album. So it was a real surprise when Taylor Swift announced this one was just dropping the next day, but I think it was a day's notice we got for Folklore. And not only was that surprising, but it was a very different sounding record for Taylor. She teamed up with Aaron Dessner and delved way more into folk than she had on any of her other records and really surprised people. And what this record did, I think, was like a career resuscitation because Lover had not been received overly well. It had really struggled to get a major hit. And that was the first time I felt like Taylor Swift's footing was maybe going a little bit awry in some kind of way. And Folklore put her back on path, but not only put her back on path, but put her on a totally different trajectory towards just basically like owning the pop industry. I guess her imperial era starts with Folklore, and I think goes all the way through the Eras tour as well. Folklore is an incredibly important album. I think shows that she can run her own race and shows that she can kind of do whatever she wants genre-wise, and audiences will follow. It was also helped by the fact that Folklore is a great album. I think critics loved it. Obviously, it did well commercially, and then the next year went on to win Album of the Year at the Grammys. That's obviously difficult to maintain that kind of like impact over 5 years, but I think we've just seen this week going into August that August is once again in the global Spotify charts because it is August. But I think it shows that this album just still has cultural relevancy. I think that it was easily one of the best parts of the Eras show. And I feel like many of these songs, Cardigan, August, This Is Me Trying, I could honestly keep going because there's so many, but I think so many of them still have a place in pop music's like, what's the word that I'm trying to think of here? Has a place in kind of, I guess, just like the pop music psyche even now. And that's important to show that an album has aged well. I feel like Folklore, maybe above all her albums, is the album that's going to continue aging well because I feel like the sound is kind of timeless. It's not tied to any particular period of pop music. And while there's sort of an intimacy to the record that might mimic some of the feelings that were tied to COVID, I think that it's managed to outlast that period and still sounds incredibly good and is still regarded as an incredibly good Taylor Swift album. So Folklore has aged well. On to Evermore, which is an album that I have a soft spot for. It's definitely the rogue sister of Folklore. The sounds are a little bit rougher. It's a little bit more experimental and it's a little bit more unpolished as well. But it has many of my favorite Taylor Swift songs, one of them being 'Tis the Damn Season, which I think is just an exceptional song. But I guess in coming so soon after Folklore, and given that Folklore was such an important album for her and Evermore essentially followed the same kind of formula when it came to the release, it was always going to be difficult for this one to step out of the shadow of Folklore. And I don't think it's ever quite been able to do that. I know for a lot of people, they love Evermore and they feel like it's one of her best. And I certainly don't think it's one of her worst. I think it's like up there in the top half of Taylor Swift albums. But I just think culturally it's forgotten in the wake of Folklore. And I think for that reason, I'm going to say that Evermore perhaps hasn't aged so well and hasn't been able to keep up the initial excitement. I wouldn't say that there's a quote unquote hit from this record. The next one is a record that's kind of similar, Phoebe Bridgers' Punisher. Punisher is, again, a very intimate album, a very expansive, emotional, world-building kind of album, and it sucked you in and I think created a superstar in Phoebe Bridgers. Before this, I think she was almost a niche alt-pop name, and it really rose her to the top, and I feel like that's almost a product of the thing that people were craving during lockdown, which was either the dance pop music that Future Nostalgia or Chromatica gave us, and then this more like intimate, in your feels type music. And Punisher did that incredibly well. I think led the runway for her to come through with Boy Genius, which is an arguably commercially even more successful project than Punisher is. But I think that Phoebe Bridgers, because of this album, is one of the mainstays of pop music now. And I think when her next album comes, it's going to be an incredibly important record. And that's because of the foundations that Punisher has laid. I think that critics love this album. And I've seen that when people have put out their lists of the best albums of the 2020s so far, this one is always high up. So I feel like Punisher has definitely aged well. Fiona Apple's Fetch the Bolt Cutters. This is an album that famously got a 10 from Pitchfork when it was released. It did also have quite a feeling that mimics the feeling of lockdown, in the fact that it felt at times like she basically rifled through the kitchen drawer to find instruments for this album. incredibly emotionally aggressive, incredibly unhinged in the best way, very percussive, and an album that I still go back to because I think that every single Fiona Apple record is so singular in that it's so difficult to tie it to the time that it was released because her artistic vision is just completely undiluted by what's going on in the mainstream or even what's going on in alternative music. And it would be silly to say that this album has aged badly. Moving on to Miley Cyrus's Plastic Hearts, which is a really interesting one because when this record was released, I felt like it was a real renaissance for Miley. I don't think so commercially. I think that some of the songs have gone on to do very well, like years down the track, including Angels Like Me, which is one of her most streamed songs now. But I think at the time, Plastic Hearts was not really doing that well in the charts. But I felt like Miley had really tapped into a kind of music that she loved, and she was really thriving in that zone. And only in the past couple months since the release of Something Beautiful have we learnt that that's actually not the case, that she doesn't really like Plastic Heart. She feels like it's underbaked. She doesn't like the vocal production, all this stuff about it that she doesn't like, which makes me reevaluate this album so much because all the things that I felt like were capturing the real Miley Cyrus, she didn't feel like that was actually happening. So I'm on the fence about whether this one has aged well or not because I feel like in the past 6 months it hasn't aged well. But before then, I would have definitely said that Plastic Hearts was aging well. The next one is Haim's Women in Music Part 3. Obviously, Haim have just released a new album called I Quit. Women in Music Part 3 was actually my favorite album, I said, of 2020. And looking at this list, I'm wondering if I still agree with that. And if I don't agree with that, I still think that it ranks very highly up. I feel like it's a major moment for Haim because it really got rid of the polish that they had on their music and got straight to the emotional core of it. I think that Danielle's vocals are more untamed than ever. I love the arrangements. I feel like it really feels like it's just the three of them going in, and it has some of their best songs, I think, including the steps and then the bonus tracks with Now I'm In It and stuff. It just took them to a level that I didn't think they were going to be able to get to on their first two albums, because I didn't think they'd be able to look past that pop sheen. And honestly, I think because they did that, they made kind of a timeless record, because it's not, I think that the record before this one, what was it? I'm trying to remember what it was actually called. It was called Something to Tell You, which I thought was a good album, but it definitely has aged, I think. Whereas Women in Music Part 3, I don't think it has aged. I still love hearing these songs live. I saw them just a couple months ago and really enjoyed the ones they played off Women in Music Part 3. I think that lyrically, it's really, really strong as well, and just introduces us to new elements of Haim that are pretty powerful. I think Danielle's exploration of depression in particular on this record is very powerful. So I'm going to say that Women in Music Part 3 aged well. One that I feel like has come back into the conversation very recently is Charli XCX's How I'm Feeling Now. This is an exceptional album, I think, and a lockdown album in every sense of the word, in that it was created in 5 weeks, basically, over April and May, I think it was, and gave us this almost escapist club record that was also very emotional and very frantic as well. And I did wonder how this one was going to stand up, because it is such a fragment of time from the lockdown period. But I think the success of Party For You over the past couple months has only proved that the sound of this album was ahead of its time. And because of that, it's aging exceptionally well. I actually think that this album is aging better than Crash, the one that came after it. And I think kind of laid the bed for what she was going to do on Brat, which I think takes this sound and maximizes it even more. So I really think that How I'm Feeling Now has aged very well. Let's talk about Halsey Manic, which was an album that actually kind of made me a Halsey fan. I guess I think a song like You Should Be Sad is just brilliant pop music. And I feel like in a year where we got so much music that felt like it was very attached to lockdown, in many ways this album felt like a proper sort of blockbuster pop record. it had many different sides to it. It's kind of all over the place stylistically, manic, if you will. I think obviously Without Me was such a massive hit for her. And there was a part of this record to me now listening to it that feels like she's chasing another hit while also trying to do what she actually wants to do. And I think she gets the core of what she actually wants to do on the next album, which she produced with 9 Inch Nails and went in a totally different rock direction. I could feel the frustration of this record, of her trying to get there. And for that reason, I think that it hasn't aged incredibly well, because I think what she does on the next 2 albums is more like mining what Halsey actually is and what she wants to do musically, whereas this one feels caught in between 2 worlds. And I think she does both worlds quite well. But now going back and listening to it, I'm just not so sure it melds very well. And I don't know if any of these songs, apart from Without Me, have really stood the test of time outside of the Halsey fan base. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to say this one hasn't aged incredibly well. For me, Jessie Ware's What's Your Pleasure? This was a big one for Jessie as well, a massive career revival for her, and really put her into the dance pop space, which is a space she hadn't been in before. And I feel like this is a record that was just timed perfectly, because obviously it wasn't written in lockdown. It was ready to go before lockdown was announced. But just like Dua Lipa, she really just stepped into the whole thing and did the lockdown performances and just happily made it a soundtrack to people for their living rooms. And that was really clever, because I feel like it's frustrating to make a record like this and then not be able to perform it in the club or perform it at festivals where it's really made for. But instead it became a huge source of comfort for people and just tapped into a sound that I think throughout history is known for escapism and known for soundtracking particularly difficult times. I know because a lot of people were kind of going back to the music of like a disco queen like Donna Summer during this period. And What's Your Pleasure, just almost by luck, suits that down to the ground. And I think is also a phenomenal record. Like, I don't think that it falls into the same kind of disco tropes that like Chromatica, or dance pop tropes rather, that Chromatica or Future Nostalgia does. I think that it's a little bit more of an adventurous and experimental record when it comes to that kind of thing. But it's so effective in just taking you to a different place. And I still think that this album sounds so fresh. I mean, I love that it's vintage in its nostalgia, but it's also looking so forward to the future. And the club sounds that she uses across it, I think just it still sounds so inventive and so fun to listen to now. So I think that this is a really important record from 2020 and certainly one of the best albums from this period. So I'm going to say that it aged well. Chloe and Halle's Ungodly Hour. This was speaking of people who really nailed the lockdown performances, Chloe and Halle were all across it. Like, that tennis court that they were performing on became an iconic kind of symbol of the lockdown time. And I think that's because they just have so much natural talent radiating from them that they've always kind of created in-house anyway. So they weren't really restricted by not having a huge team around them, because they are already so kind of self-serving in that way. Self-serving sounds like I'm calling them selfish. I'm not. They were certainly not selfish during this period. This album, to go back and listen to, I still absolutely love. This is like futuristic soul music mixed with dance music. There is obviously the Disclosure production on a song like Ungodly Hour, which I think has only gotten better with time, and to me just sounds so fresh now. I think particularly the performances in the music video of Ungodly Hour have aged so well. And I feel like because maybe Chloe and Halle's solo careers haven't gone as planned, this record only feels better and better in retrospect. And to be honest, this is one of the most exciting records from 2020 now when I really think back on it. And I think when you don't, I wasn't entirely sold on Chloe and Halle's music before 2020, but then when you listen to something and it really makes you a fan, I think it makes it even more exciting. And that's certainly how I feel about this album. So I'm going to say that it's aged well. It's still an album that I go back and listen to quite a lot. Justin Bieber changes. Justin Bieber obviously has just released Swag, but he also released Justice after this one. And I feel like you only needed to look at what he did on Justice to know that Changes was not really the right album. Justice was a huge course correction, went back into the pop world and kind of made sure that he still had footing there, whereas he really lost it with Changes. I mean, I think that parts of this album are redeemable. I actually think Intentions is like one of his best singles, and I really like Forever as well. But Yummy is really one of the worst songs from this year. And I think the way that he was really clamoring to get that song to number one, and even telling fans like how they could get it there with sort of lame infographics, is more of an indication that this album was just not right and it was kind of doomed from the beginning. He always wants to go into this R&B sound, but sometimes he's not able to rise to the occasion and bring enough flavor to it. And I feel like whereas on Journals, which was an incredibly personal and almost rebellious record, Changes feels like he's coasting. And I think Swag, again, is a good example of like how he can do it really well when he is trying to do something different, whereas this was just going into like the trap-based production that was really popular in the 2020s. And I honestly think that Changes is one of the worst albums from this year. So I don't think it's aged well whatsoever. Ariana Grande's Positions, which was kind of doing a similar thing to Justin Bieber's Changes in terms of going into that trap-based sound. She had been on a run at this stage. She'd given us Sweetener, she'd given us Thank You Next, and then this album in the space of like, I think it was like 2 years, basically. This album was kind of trashed when it was released because I don't think that has the immediate impact that what Thank You Next had. Thank You Next was a very like splashy, emotionally forward record that was almost headline grabbing in the lyrics that she was giving, and Positions just didn't have that. Instead, it's like a much more late night bedroom focused album. And because of that, I think it took a little time for these songs to really make sense, I suppose. I don't think it was particularly the right music for lockdown, even though it was a very intimate like album about just spending time with your significant other. But for one reason or another, it just didn't really hit people right. I think that it had some hits. Positions was a huge hit. And then 34 plus 35 was a pretty big hit. POV could have been bigger, but I think she said that she kind of stopped the promotion of the album then because the response just wasn't what she had hoped for. But I feel like going back to this album, it is really good. Like her vocal production in particular is like exquisite. I love how she learnt the tools to vocally produce, and she's just a master at it. And I feel like this is the album where you can really start to hear that. The layering and the harmonies are insane. And I feel like she's not belting on this album, but it's making such an impact because it just sounds so pretty. I think that the melodies are not instantaneous like a huge pop song, but they do sink under your skin and really take effect in the years following. A song like Safety Net, for example, I think is just like, for me, become so special over the years. So I think that this album has aged incredibly well, and I feel like her fans feel that way. And I'm excited to see like when when we're 10 years down the track, even how this album ages, because I think it's going to be one of those ones that fans really start writing for and really start putting up high in the ranking of Ariana Grande records. Let's move on to Rina Sawayama's Sawayama, her debut album, which I think was a massive moment because a lot of people discovered her in lockdown. And I feel like a lot of people had time to discover music during lockdown, and she was one of the ones who really benefited from that. Sawayama is a wild ride. It traverses so many genres. You've obviously got something more traditionally dance pop like Comme des Garçons, but then something like Dynasty, which is just like this wild sort of rock opera almost, even evanescence in sound. And I love how she bridged that all together, and she just gave herself no limitations. And I feel like it was so exciting to listen to. I think that people felt like the next album didn't quite deliver on the promise that she'd set up with this record of being one of the most exciting and experimental and wild pop stars around. And that's a shame, but I don't think that it's dulled the light of Sawayama because I feel like people just want her to go back to what she was making on this album and almost forget about Hold the Girl, even though I quite liked Hold the Girl personally. But this was such an exciting album to listen to during lockdown. I remember just feeling like I was being slapped at every turn with what direction it was going in. And that's exactly what we needed at that time, some surprise, some excitement. And Sawayama gave that and just continued to give that when she was eventually able to tour the record the following year or the year after that. I think that it's aged well, and I think that it still stands up. Let's talk about Katy Perry's Smile. This is an interesting album again because she had to promote it in a very weird way. She did a lot of creative performances, and I actually think that her lockdown performances were very good. This album comes together over a matter of years because the first single, Never Really Over, is released at the beginning of, or kind of at the midway point of 2019, and then she tries a couple singles that don't make the record and a couple make it on. I mean, it's just a little bit messy, and I feel like it doesn't really entirely make sense as an album now. It feels like a collection of songs. And while I do think that some of these songs are quite fun, I think like Teary Eyes has sort of stood the test of time. Obviously, I think that Never Really Over is incredible. But for the most part, it just kind of feels like a safe album, an attempt to course correct what she did on Witness, which is obviously way more experimental. And I just don't think that it's overly, I don't know. Whereas we were talking about Sawayama, which felt like it was like in your face and just like, you need to listen to this. Smile feels like background music. And I think it's probably one of the least essential records in Katy Perry's discography. So I'm going to say that it didn't age well. Selena Gomez's Rare, a very interesting album to talk about because it was almost stopped in its tracks by COVID rather than being like kind of put up on a pedestal by COVID, which many of the other albums we've talked about kind of benefited from the COVID experience. But Rare, I think, came too early in the year, and because of that, they didn't really know what to do with the album once everything went to shit. Obviously, a number one single in Lose You to Love Me. A few tongue twisters today. Lose You to Love Me, a number one single in that. And then she had that kind of disastrous performance, which really, I don't think helped the feeling going into this album. I think that Rare is just like not that exciting a record, to be honest. Like, it tries a lot of different things and tries some that come off well. I actually think the title track is pretty successful in what it does, but for the most part, I just don't think that there's enough to really sink your teeth into. I feel like the album that she dropped this year with Benny Blanco has a little bit more to get excited about than Rare does. It's a kind of like not overly interesting pop album. So I'm going to say that this one didn't age well, and I think it's also a product of like obviously an unfortunate situation that it didn't do better commercially in the end. Let's talk about Bad Bunny's YHLQMDLG. If I've got that right. There's obviously a much longer Spanish name to it, which I am not going to horrify you by trying to read out. This was the album for me that I think made Bad Bunny a pretty obvious superstar, and again was just such an exciting moment for 2020 when things didn't feel overly exciting. Traverses so many different styles, does so many exciting things. Even within like one song, it can do so much. This album obviously comes just before lockdown, but then Bad Bunny's star just continues to rise throughout it. I think that songs like Yo Perrea Sola go on to be like some of his most recognizable songs, and I just feel like lay the foundations for many great albums to come. This one stands up for me with Un Verano Sin Ti and Debbie Mira Mas Fotos from this year as well. I think that he is incredible, and I feel like this showed how much he could play with genre. So I think this album has aged incredibly well. Maybe one of the best, but she's still obviously unfortunately tied to Dr. Luke's label at this time. And whereas Rainbow had gone into more of a sort of introspective sound and it kind of almost suited the situation that she was in, and then Gag Order did that as well. This one attempted to break the mold, and I don't think it did it entirely successful. I think that it had some really fun songs on it, but ultimately, I don't think that this album has aged well. And I think that what it's trying to do is what Period is doing right now, perhaps more successfully, which is a real career rejuvenation for Kesha. But I just don't know if this one quite got there, unfortunately. So I'm going to say this one aged poorly as well. Finally, I'm going to talk about Megan Thee Stallion's Good News. This was her proper debut album, and I feel like this one was an interesting one because it did try to capitalize on the hype, and I think at times it did. I feel like a song like Body, for example, has become one of the trademark Megan Thee Stallion songs, but ultimately I think it tried to do a lot, and I don't know if it totally sticks for me 5 years later exactly what she was going to do. In saying that though, she does release a record earlier in 2020, which I think is much more interesting, which is the Sugar EP, which ends up having Savage on it. Savage obviously blows up in 2020 and makes Megan Thee Stallion one of the biggest names around. And I think that album just had so much more texture and nuance to it and cohesiveness. And I feel like even the tighter track listing makes it a lot more successful, whereas Good News was a lot more larger scale. It was a lot longer. And because of that, I feel like maybe a quarter of the album still hit. So unfortunately, that one's also probably an aged not well for me too, which brings me to the end of the list of my 2020 albums that I'm going to be discussing today. If you feel like I got it wrong on anything, you can comment, obviously. Join us in the discourse, or you can also send a voice note. I'll drop the email below if you want to reach us there, and I'll play it out on the podcast, on one of the next podcasts, and respond to it too. Other than that, thank you so much for joining for another episode of the Pop Pod. We will be back on Friday, I believe, with Bop or Flop. If not, it will be in the days following that, but we're going to try and get that episode out on Friday. Jono is away this week, so I'm going to have a guest for that. I will see you on Friday. Thank you for joining. Don't forget to like or subscribe if you're not already, and rate the podcast 5 stars. Goodbye.